We're going to talk to you today about the life of a game story. That is the life cycle of a game story from wild idea to published game. We decided to have this talk because most people don't know what that life cycle looks like. They think it's something like this. You have this great idea, hand waving, something happens, and then voila, you've made a profit and you have this miraculous game story. So we wanted to sort of pull back the hood a little bit and talk about what really goes on when you're starting to make a game to the time that you're actually pushing it out the door. So I would like to introduce us. My name is Anna Megill. I'm the lead writer at Ubisoft Massive in Sweden. I've been writing for 15 years in the games industry. I've worked at mostly AAA studios, obviously Ubisoft. Before that, I was at Remedy Entertainment working on Control. Before that, I was working with Arkane and Bethesda on a Dishonored game. And before that, I think it was Ubisoft again, and ArenaNet and Nintendo and Square Enix and a whole bunch of other places. But that's been my experience mostly, the AAA studios. And this is Annie Reid. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Annie Reid. I'm narrative director at Ubisoft Massive in Sweden. I have worked in AAA games for about 11 years, and I've been in the entertainment industry for almost 20 years. I worked on Tom Clancy's The Division, Dead Rising 2, Dead Rising 3, among other titles. I used to be a story editor and a script reader, a screenwriter in the film industry before that. And I've taught at UCLA and University of Texas. So I've done a bunch of story stuff for many years.
Many years, excellent. And so we're here to talk about stories, and every story starts with an idea, a spark in the darkness. And sometimes those are wild ideas, and they should be in the beginning. You should try not to limit your imagination and just sort of let it go, run amok and do whatever it wants to do. I think the biggest mistake that people make when they're coming up with their original idea for the game is that they try to limit it too soon. I mean, think about what really is the story that you want to tell, what's burning inside you, what game is not out there that you want to see made. This is what you should be thinking about at this stage. Just let it all loose, throw any idea out there. I mean, maybe you want to make a game about, I don't know, psychic kids at a summer camp. Or maybe you can finally make that deep dive into lore with that Dark Souls-like game that you've always dreamed of. Or maybe you're going to have a procedurally generated world, a very ambitious game, where the players can sort of have emergent storytelling and piece together their own stories based on the world that you supply. Or maybe you can put them all together and make one game out of all of those ideas. It's up to you, but dream big and don't limit yourself at this stage. Just think about what you would like to see in the world and what story you want to tell. It's important that you're passionate about this idea if you're going to carry it through to the end. And I have to admit, when I was putting together this slide, I thought I really want to play this game, so if any of you wants to make it, please do. But once you have this wild idea, it's time to start narrowing it down and make it like slightly less wild. So when you come back to Earth, start thinking about what that game might actually look like. How would you write that story about psychic kids in space with a deep dive into lore? Is it even possible to tell that story? And is that the story that you want to tell? And once you've decided, yes, this is the story, psychic kids in space, Dark Souls-like, then do some research. There is a whole world of games out there. Games don't exist in a vacuum. There are trends that people are following. You might have noticed that right now there are a lot of battle royale games like Fortnite and PUBG. That's not a coincidence. Someone saw that that was a successful type of game to market, and so they're all sort of modeling themselves on that. There's also a cultural zeitgeist. I mean, what are people talking about? What is it that they're interested in? What is going to be the next great thing? That's something you should think about. Now, I'm not saying you can't make your game if it doesn't fit in with this market, but you're going to want to know what that is. I mean, the idea, ultimately, is that you make enough money from this game that you can pay for it, maybe have a little bit left over so you can perhaps make another game. But if you want to make that game about psychic kids in space, and it doesn't fit the Battle Royale model, then don't worry about it. Make that game if that's what your passion is, but just be aware of what the odds are in your market. So once you figured out what the market is, and what kind of game you're going to make, then you need to establish the needs for your project. This is a great slide. So the main thing is cost. I mean, games are expensive. How are you going to get the money? Are you going to have a Kickstarter? Is that how you're going to raise the money for the game? Are you going to write up a pitch and go to a major publisher like EA and see if they'll help you get your game out there? You need to think about that. When you hire staff, how are you going to pay them? You have to pay your staff, by the way, to pay them. And the market, you know, as I mentioned before, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. Is your game better suited for one market or another? Would it do better in Asia? Is it more suited for the US market? These are things you might want to think about when you're putting together your thought process for how to make the game. Feasibility. I mean, is this game story that you want to tell possible with the resources that are available to you that you will be able to afford? I mean, you're not going to be able to make the Last of Us level really cinematic cutscenes if you're working in Unity. Probably not. You're probably not going to have the budget for that. A lot of studios, very few studios actually do. So keep that in mind. Are you going to be able to get the tech that you need, the help that you need, the resources that you need to tell the story the way you want to tell it, and to build the game around it with the systems that you need to deliver this story? These are all things you really need to hammer out ahead of time. And you need to come up with a plan. You're going to need a team of people to make this game. Some people, yes, can make a game all by themselves. To the Moon, Stardew Valley, either very small teams or one person just working on their own. It can be done, but most people need to hire a bunch of other people to help them. Programmers, artists, sometimes a producer to keep you on track. Make sure that you have, writers, let's not forget writers. Everyone needs a writer. But put together the team that you need that's going to help you actually deliver the story that you want to tell. You're going to need a schedule. When do you want to release the story? If you're trying to catch a trend, like this Battle Royale trend, you want to make sure that you're not pushing your game out 7 years from now, because who knows what the trend is going to be when that finally comes out. So be realistic about that. And your budget. Make sure you give yourself a little bit of buffer, that you're paying your staff, that you are accounting for dependencies and risks, because things happen. You're going to have someone leave and go to another job, or someone's going to get sick, or something won't come through that you thought you were going to have in terms of tech. All of these things happen. You need to plan for them. I'm sure you've all heard about crunch. It's a big problem in our industry. And what that really is a failure of planning. Someone somewhere did not account for all of the things that went wrong, or scope got blown out of proportion. Something happened, and they're trying to make that up by pushing the workers to put in more labor to make up for the lost time, the lost resources. And it's really unfair, and it's very unhealthy. So don't do it. Just plan accordingly and be realistic about what your needs and dependencies and risks are, and you'll be okay. So you've probably listened to this and you're like, well, this is great sort of general advice if I'm going to make a game, but what about the story? And we're going to get to that right now. Annie's going to tell you about how to lay the foundations for the story of the game you want to make.
So foundations. What's the shape of your story going to be? And Anna's going to talk about this in much more detail, but I'm just going to go over a few of the pieces. Like, what is the real estate for your story? Like, what are the tools that you have to tell it? So this is a thing to think about as you're designing your story. You're going to have traditional cutscenes, ambient dialogue, like there's people in the background having a conversation. In The Division, we had people like having random conversations that you could listen in on that help build out the world. Are you going to have branching dialogue? Are there going to be choices in dialogue or in player choice that impact what scenes might play later on? Barks, which if you don't know is a term for, usually we use barks to refer to systematic dialogue. For example, if you're in a game like The Division and you're battling an enemy and the enemy is like, I'm out of ammo, or I'm reloading, or fire in the hole. So they're going to be doing a certain gameplay action, and you can respond accordingly. Environmental storytelling, graffiti, things, there's a lot of environmental artists who can do a great storytelling by creating a little mise en scene, a collection of props in a corner that tell a story of somebody that may have been there once. We used to do this a lot. I've worked for 10 years in post-apocalyptic games, and so I'm a real appreciator of this kind of storytelling. And the supplemental materials, audio logs, found objects, cassette tapes, whatever it is. And then ask yourself how much of your story is absolutely essential for the player experience. So for example, in Journey, there's not really a lot of optional storytelling. You basically experience all of the story content as you're playing through it for the most part. Whereas in Division, we had a certain amount of cutscenes that were there to explain, that were mandatory for you to experience, that explained who you were, what your mandate is, what the context of the world is, and then occasionally there's a scene that sort of tells you how things have progressed or to give you an important mission. But then there's a lot of other stuff in that game that's for people who like lore and like narrative. So there's audio logs and echoes and a lot of other material that you can explore if you want to. Is your game a linear game or a non-linear game? Is it an open world game where the player can engage with systems and create their own story experience? Or is it a heavily authored game? Like The Last of Us is a great game, I think, but it's a very structured game because it's an authored linear experience where they can control emotions and context. Whereas in a game like Skyrim, you can make choices that will change your experience, and the game developers don't necessarily have control over things like what has just happened to you when they create certain moments. I encourage you, as you're building your game, to make a story Bible. And this is a term you may have heard used in reference to TV shows. But a Bible is a collection of lore and basically the rules of your game so that the people who are working on the game, and not just the narrative people, but artists, level designers, environmental artists, and particularly for the kind of storytelling I've been in, AAA, actors and directors. So in the TV, people use story Bibles, as I said, to share the rules of the TV world with a variety of writers. For us, it's literally about how you're going to frame your story. So things that go in your story Bible are things like, what time are we in? Is it 1492? Is it the year 2000? Is it prehistory? Is it 10,000 years ago? Is it 3,000 years in the future? What kind of world is it? Is it our world, or is it with just some rules change? Like, is it our world and our time with zombies? Is it our world and our time with a plague? Is it the future with zombies? What happened just before your game began? What world events happened so we know the context for your game? Is it a magical world or a fantasy world? What are the rules by which magic works if it's a magical world? If there are groups of non-humans, what are the qualities of those groups? Are there elves? Are there hobbits? Are there aliens? What are the rules and behavior of those groups? I encourage you to actually go into quite a lot of detail, to be a little more granular than you might at first expect to be, because of the way that other people on the project can use this information to inform their own work. Also themes. I'm working on a story Bible right now that includes important themes that we are interested in conveying in our world. For example, if you want to tell a game about justice, if you want to tell a game about anti-imperialism, if you want to tell a game about truth, if you want to tell a game about the way people are when they get guns, there's lots of different things, there's lots of different big ideas. You should put them down if you're thinking about them. Thematic clarity can add a lot of depth to your game stories. Although if you're too obvious about those themes in dialogue, you will create terrible dialogue, so you should make those themes. I encourage you to think about them, but to keep them implicit rather than explicit. The rules for your world, and also the language of your world. So, do you have narrative principles that you want to follow? I do in the games that I've been making. So for example, a principle that I put into my story Bible is no gendered insults. So bitch, for example, no gendered insults in the games that I work on. No sexual assault as entertainment. So this is a thing that I put in my story Bible to say, this is not an experience we want to depict or exploit in any way. Swearing, to what degree is it okay with you in your game world? What age rating are you going for? What age are you targeting? What is the language and the content appropriate to that level? In my case, do you use the Oxford comma? Yes, you do. Your characters. Obviously, you need to have some characters. Spend some time before you write the dialogue thinking about who they are. Put that in your story Bible as well. Not just the main ones, but everyone in your game. So the key cast. Who's driving the action? What are their needs, wants, flaws? And then once you have a cast of characters, it's a very good idea to look at them in relation to each other and make sure that they're sufficiently different from each other so you're not repeating essentially the same character with a little bit of different flavor. Make sure you have a broad range of human emotions, because even if you're writing hobbits or aliens, your characters will embody some qualities of humanity that we recognize. That's why we respond to hobbits and elves in The Lord of the Rings, because they're not humans, but they embody qualities that we recognize as human in some way. So make sure you just have a broad cast of characters that's expressing a wide range. Who are the other NPCs that populate your world? Who are they? What do they want? What are they doing there? And then your story. After you've done all this, spend some time figuring out your story, beginning, middle, and end. And Anna will talk about more about this. I want to talk a little bit about style and tone, which is something else I put in my story Bibles. Because again, it's helpful for anybody who's working on the game to understand what the style and tone is. And I'll give you a couple of examples why it's so important. In AAA, we invest in actors and voice directors. And it's critical even for them to understand what the precise style and tone of your game is. So these are 3 zombie games. These are all zombie games. If I said we're working on a zombie game, you might extrapolate that it was one of these: Dead Rising, Plants vs. Zombies, or Resident Evil 3. So it matters what the tone is. Is it satirical? Is it over the top? Is it cartoonish? Is it dead serious? Is it horror? So you need to be able to communicate that to other people on your team and any external clients like directors and actors. So for example, I mentioned this before, so apologies if you were in my earlier panel, but I worked on a game where there was no writer on the recording session. At the recording session, the director misunderstood the tone and gave directions to the actors to be a little cartoony and a little bit over the top. We got it, put it in the game, and it was very apparent that none of it fit. And this was many actors doing many barks, so we had to do a lot of it all over again because there was a miscommunication about the style and the tone. It's very helpful sometimes in a tone Bible to create a list of references that are like it. So for example, if I was doing a satirical zombie game, I would say it's kind of more like Dead Rising and less like Plants vs. Zombies. It's helpful sometimes to have a lot of examples on not only your vision, but your anti-vision, so that there's no mistaking it. And now, over to you.
So listen to all of this advice that Annie gave, follow it religiously, the story Bible, and lay the foundations of the world. This is just essential world building that you're going to need when you start moving into your story and you actually start realizing it. So going back to what I was discussing earlier about setting the parameters for the story, you need to know what narrative delivery tools you have. You have a toolbox for getting the story to the player. And these are things like quests and cutscenes, systemic dialogue, which involves AI. Those are the greets and the barks that we've been talking about. User interface elements, things like menus or item descriptions. All kinds of text like the player journal, objectives, graffiti, and audio. There are lots of audio logs in games in case you all had not noticed. And so I'm just going to walk you through each of these things and talk a little bit about what they can do, what each of these tools can do to help deliver the story to the player. So you're all pretty familiar with quests. I think most people think of this as sort of the meat of the game. That's what you do when you're playing a game. You go on quests, whether they're structured or not. And the sort of basic quest structure is there's an NPC with an exclamation point over their head in most games, and you walk up to them and they say something like, "Hey stranger, go kill 10 rats for me." And you don't know why, but you go and you kill 10 rats and you bring them back and you get a reward. That's the pretty standard quest structure. That's a fetch quest. But it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And pretty much every quest or mission that you create in the game should have that. That's how you're also going to structure your game. Your story is going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you're going to fill that up with quests. You'll complete quests up to a certain point, you'll level up, you'll complete more quests, and finally you'll get to the end where you'll have some sort of encounter with a boss-like figure, and you'll win, and you'll be a hero, and yay, it'll all be awesome. But like even pinball, if you think about it, has quests to a certain extent, and I have this argument with other game writers a lot. But if you're playing pinball, you get some sort of assignment. They're like, you can rescue the princess if you hit these targets in a certain order, and then you do that and you get a reward, which is ideally multi-ball. But that's a quest in pinball. And that's a great way to deliver story, and it's something that players are very familiar with. But you also need to be aware of what surrounds each quest. What is it coming from? What is it leading into? So you can tell a cohesive story. So you also want to, as Annie was discussing the big themes of your game and the subtext, you want to work those through the quest. You want to make sure that they feel organic to the general story. If you have a game with a pacifist character and their goal is to bring peace to the realm, and then they end up slaughtering their way through the entire game, and that's what all the quests are about, you've probably failed to tell the story that you want to tell the way you want to tell it. So just be aware of that. And of course, you're going to work with the other teams to realize this vision. Your world's going to do a lot of work, all the environmental storytelling, the character design, the VO, all the things Annie mentioned. And then you have to make it all fun. And that's the tricky part. So cutscenes. I taught a whole tutorial on this a few days ago, but I'm only going to sort of hit the high notes here. But when we were talking about setting your parameters for the story in the introduction, it's important that you do that so that you're not trying to make those really top-tier cinematic cutscenes that you might not have the budget for. If you have only got 15 minutes worth of cutscenes, you have to use them strategically and economically. Maybe it's better to use a montage style of cutscene, or just transitional ones, just like a camera fly through the level to show that a door has opened somewhere. You know, you have to be aware of what your budget is and how you can use these small cinematic moments very strategically to deliver the information you want and give the player the experience that you want. How many are you going to have? Where are they going to go? These are things you need to figure out and be very careful when you're crafting it. And then you have to go write them. And now we get to the screenplays. I think this is just from screenwriting.com or screenwriters.com. I just Googled screenplay format, and this was the first image that popped up if you guys are interested in looking at the parts yourself. But what a screenplay essentially is a blueprint for everyone else on the team. You're telling them the information they need to know to create this vision that you've got in your head. So you're telling, for example, the level designer where this is located and what the lighting is like. Is it day or is it night? You're telling the character artists what the character looks like and how they're going to behave so they can create a look for them that's appropriate. You're giving lines to the actor, and Annie has recently sold me on not using parentheticals in screenplays because it limits the actor's performance. You're much better off putting in script notes that the director can read to the actors to set up the scene for them. You know, instead of saying frustrated, the director might say something like, you come home and you have trouble getting through the door and you finally break in and then you discover your house has been robbed, you know, and go. And then you allow the actor to interpret that scene. So, yeah, so just be thinking about that when you're writing these screenplays, that you're actually giving instructions to other people. They need to be clear and concise, and that people might interpret things differently than you do, so always have communication. When you are sending out screenplays, you're also going to have to cast the actors for these roles, which means you're going to have to write character bios. And I think Annie touched on this a little bit. You want to leave room for the actors to interpret these roles. Don't write a huge, long novel about everything this character has ever done. Give the artist a little room to interpret it and give a performance, and they'll probably come up with something better than you ever thought of. It's a collaboration, so give them room to work. And you'll also have to come up with a casting script or screenplay that they can read to try out for these roles. And that's its own special beast. I'm not going to go into what is involved in that, But it's usually something that's a lot like your game, but it's not actually your game because it's probably very heavily under NDA when you are casting for these roles. So it's a bit of a challenge to write these and get what you want. But have faith in you all. There's also ambient and systemic dialogue. You probably recognize the NPC. You walk up and they say, well, hello there. And I know that we've talked a bit about this before, but this can really make your world feel alive, even if it is AI and it's pulling on this bank of pre-written lines. If you have characters in the background of your world and they have lives, if they're talking about things that they've done or things that are happening in the world that are separate from you, it really makes everything come together and feel alive. It's not like they're just standing there waiting for you to interact with them. They're real people who interact with this world in ways that have really nothing to do with you, and when you're gone, they'll keep living their lives. And keep that in mind when you're populating your world with them. They don't have to just stand there with an exclamation point over their heads. Oh yeah, and when you're writing this stuff, give yourself more time than you think you're going to need to write them, because it's a lot harder than you think to come up with 150 different ways to say hello there. There are also user interface elements, the menus of the game, the objectives, item descriptions for like each weapon, like the tooltips. If you want to know what each skill does, you'll get the little window that pops up in the corner and says that. All the different menus of the game. These might not seem like important things to you, but someone has to write them. It's usually going to be the writer. And players, even players who don't like story, are going to spend a lot of time in these menus looking at these things. It's important that it's clear and succinct and it delivers the information that it needs to. It's a good place to stick lore, like this bio of High Overseer Campbell. Someone had to write that. Some people choose to put all of their lore into menus. Destiny, when it first came out, you guys might remember that the world felt a little barren and sterile according to players. But then when you left the game and you went and you looked in the codex, it was rich with lore. There were all these great stories about what was happening in the world. And that was a choice that they made that I think they later regretted a little bit. But it's a good place to tuck that lore, to make the world deeper for players who want to go digging and find out more about it. And then there's just normal text in the game. This is Chloe's journal from Life is Strange. And you can see that the writer worked very closely with the art team to create this. And it says a lot about her character. It says a lot about what her thoughts were at this time. It moves both the plot and her character forward. This is doing a lot of work for just some text in the game in a menu. So think about creative ways you can deliver that. You can have logs and journal entries. For some reason, characters in video games like to leave letters lying around all over the place that detail their deepest thoughts. There's transmedia, like Destiny's Codex. There are signs everywhere in games. There's, like I said, graffiti. We love graffiti in video games. And there are tie-ins. There might be books that are written about the IP that you're working in. You have to make sure that your story doesn't contradict or go outside the lines that have already been determined by these other properties. Or if there's going to be a sequel, you need to start thinking about setting that up. And I know Annie doesn't want me revealing the dirty secrets, but you're probably going to have to make a demo at some point. Just something that you can show to journalists at E3 or PAX to show them what your game's all about. And ideally, that's just a level that's been pulled out of the game, and you can just drop it back in again, and you'll never have to do any more work on it. But it's never like that. It's a lot of extra work, because you want to give people like the full range of the experience in a very compressed space. So it ends up being a lot of extra work, so you're going to end up having to write for that as well. Just keep that in mind. And finally, there's audio. This is a voxophone from BioShock Infinite, just a way for them to deliver lore and backstory. But these audio logs are throughout almost every game these days. You find them all over the place. And what's great about them is you can turn them on and still walk around. The sound's going to follow you, you can keep playing, so you can absorb the lore while you're still exploring the world and kill two birds with one stone. Dynamic music is really great. Has anyone here played Alan Wake? Anyone? Yeah, wow, I'm really impressed. So when you're on the stage and the music's playing and you have to time the lightning strikes with everything, that's a really fun, inventive way to use music to move your story along. I love that level. I think it's so creative. And in Dishonored, Death of the Outsider, we had a musical lock for the opera singer in that game. So he would sing a song. He was a very flamboyant person, just generally, so the lock suited him. But he would sing a song into this microphone, and if it was the right song and the right notes, it would unlock the safe where he kept, the incriminating evidence. But I thought that was also a really fun way to sort of use music to push your story forward in a way you wouldn't necessarily think about. But you have to write these things in if they're going to be in the game. And now, Annie's going to talk a little bit more about how to realize your story.
Yes, realization. I'm going to talk first about what your job is. Your job, if you're a writer or narrative designer, this is true really of anybody who works on a game. But for writers, I think, I started writing fiction, and then I wrote screenplays, and then I wrote games. And it took me a while to realize your product as a writer is not good dialogue. Your product as a writer is not compelling characters. It's not even a story. It is a user experience. It's a player experience. That's very important because it means that it's not just, your words could be good on a page, but once they're in the game, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's about that gestalt of the experience. So getting to a place, I'm going to talk a little bit about revisions and getting to a place of excellence. Try and budget into your time a lot of time for revisions because it's very unlikely you'll come up with something golden on the first try. There is unfortunately another industry dirty secret is there's a lot of first drafts in AAA games because we run out of time. But ideally you would do things multiple times, you would revise. And there's a couple of different things you can revise for. First of all, revise for economy of language, revise for compression. Dialogue in games is expensive. Audio is expensive, cutscenes are expensive if you use them. Dialogue in games tries some players' patience. Some people don't want to sit through your beautiful 12-minute cutscene. Acting also has to be a little bit compressed for that reason. So go through your dialogue, try and find ways to say the same thing more economically. Revise for gameplay. Is all the information the player needs there to understand who they are, what the context is, what they should be doing, what's going to happen next, what's happened before. Is all the information that they need there. However, I'm just going to, a little side note, I discourage you from using dialogue to explain bad level design. So try and work with your people who are designing to level so that the narrative and the level design is working together as a whole. Revise for subtext. Think like an actor. The first film I ever made, the first time I gave a script to an actor, it was a total revelation for me. The first thing she did was slash out all of the parentheticals which I'd carefully thought through and which were reflections of what the actors in my head were saying. She took them all out because she is a co-creator. Actors are co-creators. They're not just people who are hired to say the words the way you've heard them in your head. They're there to add another level of experience. They're co-creators and you should treat them as that. The other thing she did was to make a little note next to each piece of text, each of the blocks of script, and I was like, what is that? So, for example, I maybe had written something like, I can't believe you did that again, Bob. And she would write the word reminding right next to that line, which was a verb, which was, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm not just reminding him of that he did this one bad thing this one time. I'm reminding him of every time he's ever messed up, which is a lot. And that was subtext, and that's giving her a lot to work with and allowing her to give a lot more depth to the character. So when you're writing, try and think like an actor and think about how you can put in subtext and give your actors something to work with. Revise for quality, and I know this sounds a little bit obvious, but I implore you, try not to be content with the first draft or the second or even the third. Think about it like this. I used to read a lot of scripts. I've read hundreds of professional screenplays, and if you get a professional screenplay, usually they're pretty good as a professional screenwriter. So the way to approach revision is not to say what's wrong with it and what needs to be fixed. Think about how it could be great. Ask yourself, how can this be better? What will add depth? What will add more character? How can this happen in a more interesting way? Think about how things would express character, theme, and subtext. So push yourself towards excellence. There's no reason that video game writing can't be amazing, and it should be. So review, if you can, schedule time in to put things aside for a while and then go back to them, because you will see things a week later that you didn't see in the heat of the moment. Build a schedule that allows time for multiple revisions, and make sure everyone who has an investment in the game writing has signed off, like the people who designed levels where your dialogue explains what's happening in them. As I said, writing is games are a collision, if you will, a gestalt of a bunch of different systems working together. So something that you think looks good on the page or in a prototype might not look so good in the game. So you have to be able to play the game. I would encourage you, if you can, to put like robo voice or like just even like actions in brackets if you don't have a cutscene. Put stuff in the game so you can start to get a look and feel for the rhythm and the context. Play through with prototypes, do whatever kind of prototyping you are able to do. And I'm going to talk about voiceover, recording, and mocap, which is one of my favorite things about my job. And if you get a chance to work with actors, I hope you like it as well as I do. First, table reads. It is critical for you to hear your dialogue out loud before you ever go into a recording studio. So table reads are very important. A table read is just when you sit around. Ideally, you would do this with the actors, but even before you do that, you should do it with other people on the development team. And just have everybody read stuff aloud so you can hear how it sounds, and you will definitely hear when things are not working. It's also great, we did table reads with animators, so they could say, hey, this is actually impossible from an animation standpoint, or maybe if they didn't get on the horse right then, it would be a little bit easier for us to animate. So that's a great way to make sure you're getting things at an appropriate level of quality and budget. As Anna said, you need to get casting materials out, but again, don't go overboard on your casting bios, because actors don't appreciate, they want to have a little bit of room. So again, I've said it before, but I think it's super important. Actors and voice directors are people with a skill set that they've also trained and developed over a period of years usually. They are not there to just say things like you hear it in your head. They are people who are co-creators with you. If you respect that about them, you will get a much higher quality product, and you will have much better relationships with their actors. They will want to do great work for you. How can you help facilitate this? One thing is to learn how to talk to actors. There's a great book, if you ever do work with actors, called Directing Actors by Judith Weston, I believe. And it's if you do nothing else, read that book, because there's a particular way to talk to an actor that doesn't insult their craft and allows them to give a better performance. Check out the parentheticals. I was so happy when Anna told me that I had won the battle of the parentheticals. And yeah, just make sure you write them with dialogue that has subtext as well as game information. So, in a studio, again, learn how to talk to them. I really love working with actors. It was also a revelation for me the first time I did mocap, because it was so great to see these characters that I had thought about and lived with for a long time just in my head come alive, and to see how much depth a good actor can bring to your character, and how they can transform something in a way you weren't expecting, and maybe in a way that you resist initially, but that adds a lot more depth and allows them to take your work and expand it and make it even bigger. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. That's very good advice. But also don't be afraid as well. Don't be afraid to revise on the spot. Don't be afraid you should always get a take of things as written for safety, but don't be afraid to revise things on the spot in recording studios, on mocap stages, in table reads. Things always sound different when somebody says it out loud. An actor might not be able to say something that you've written that you can say, or maybe they're like, hey, you know what, this doesn't feel like something my character would say, and this is why. That's happened to me several times, and then I'm like, okay, you know what? That you're right, I see that, I understand it, so let's go with that. Allow yourself to make stuff up that seems to be suited. We had a fantastic, last time I did mocap, we had a fantastic actress who brought so much character to her small role that we decided to double her role, right there in the scene. Localization. If you don't know what localization is, it means translating a game into the language of the markets in which you want to sell your game. If you want to localize your games, into languages other than English. You have to do some prep work for that too. And I won't go into localization. It's a very long and complicated process, but I will say that from the narrative side and the writing side, you need to get the directors and actors who are going to do any localization, the style and tone guide that I mentioned before, so they understand very well the context of the game and the world that they're making this game in, so they can get assets that match what you have in English. And also you need to give them context for things. The scene notes I was talking about before. Make a bunch of notes about what the intentions of your scenes are. And then polish. You learn a lot about the narrative parts of the game when they're actually in the game. Things might not fit together. In fact, they won't fit together in the way you had expected, which is why prototypes are critical, and agility is critical once you do put stuff in the game. You might have to cut things, and you need to be prepared for that. You might have to re-record things, you almost certainly will. You might have to change the ending. You might have to cut entire characters. You might have to recast actors. That has happened on a lot of, all of those things have happened to me multiple times in my career at AAA. So just go into it with an open mind and the ability to adapt. And now, what happens when we're all done? Anna?
Well, we've gone from this wild idea to a slightly less wild idea. We've established a realistic goal for our game, researched the market, started on our game, we wrote a story bible. What else did we do? Created character bios, we built our world. We populated the world with NPCs and quests and story delivery things like cutscenes and ambient dialogue. We went into the studio with the voice actors and we recorded all of that. It's all in the game now and it's a beautiful thing. So we push it out into the world. Our publisher, or ourselves, I guess if we're a smaller scale company, gets it out there into the world, people start playing it and they love it. Yay, it's all over, right? Now you can just collapse, it's done, your game's out there. No, just kidding. Now, you have DLC to do for it. There's updates to make sure that you're keeping the game up. If it's an open world game, you have to keep content coming. You have to respond to the feedback from the players and make sure you're addressing their critiques of the game and improving the things that they want to do. And if you have a sequel, you should have already started working on that sequel a while ago so that you are prepared to get that out in a reasonable amount of time for this game. So it never ends. That's the good and the bad news at the same time. It's a circle of life, y'all. Yeah, I can hold you up here. And that's it. That is the life of a game story.
We have about 15 minutes to take questions, if you have any questions. Anybody? Yes?
Yeah, so I actually, want to say a couple of days ago, something regarding keeping news and having news stories on our video games and kind of combining that. So with the life of the game story, I know it was kind of keeping the realization to be able to combine both of those. So like taking like a real life situation and making a news-based game out of it. So would you be, I guess the question would be like, also combining within the game and people helping create the game, and the developers, also with the newscasters, or would you try and get a more in-depth thing, like from a local situation, instead of getting to the news, getting with actual people?
Sounds like a really cool idea. I think I'm not quite sure what the question is, but it sounds like a really cool idea. And if you want to come talk to me a little bit later about realizing it, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Could you explain real quick what the difference is between a lead writer and a narrative director?
There's no difference. None.
Wait a second.
Just it's different at every studio, I will say that much, but typically the narrative director, there's a hierarchy. So Annie oversees all of the story. And then I'm underneath it, sort of controlling the writing parts of the game, so the actual screenplays, the words part of it. And Annie has her eye on the bigger picture. Yeah, I mean, it is different at every studio pretty much, but in my studio, I'm responsible for the ultimate delivery of story, the characters, and the dialogue. I'm responsible for the final quality of all of those things. So that means I talk to artists, I talk to the narrative team, I talk to Anna, the lead writer, I talk to the art director, the mission director, the open world director, just with always an eye towards like how to make the world that we're creating
coherent and organic and full and feel like a real living world. And then,
And she also makes sure that the writing team and the narrative designers get the resources that we need to make the story that we want to tell. So that's why she is talking to all these other departments, and she's talking to our creative director and making sure that everyone's on the same page and we're all pointing in the same direction so we can tell the story that we want to tell. Anyone else? Yes?
What would you say the hardest part of coming up with the game story is?
Making it?
I think I've worked on both established IPs and brand new IPs, and in a brand new IP, you have like an amorphous nothingness. So, and of course, I think people in games are, especially people in AAA, I think are just, you want to make these amazing things that have never been made before. So you have all of these ideas, and you cannot do all of them. You have to, at certain points, you have to, I think when studios sometimes develop new IPs, the development period tends to get really drawn out, and it's because people don't want to ever put the stakes in the ground and say, not that, but this, because that means it's sort of like destroying your dream a little bit sometimes, but it's also necessary to move forward. You have to say, we're not going to do all of these incredible, amazing things. We're going to do this, and we're going to do it well, and that's very hard to do with a new IP. So I think for me that is it's not the most painful thing, but it's one of the harder things that you have to do, is just to put limits around your dreams.
I will add to that I get some remarkable things sent to me through the form on my website. And a lot of what I get are people who have this great game idea. And it's great, and it's going to be a wonderful game, and do I want to make it for them? Do I want to write that idea out for them? And it's clear to me when I get these emails that they have absolutely no idea what the life of a game story is and how complicated it is and all the things that lie behind it. There's honestly just this whole, I've got an idea and that's enough. The hardest part about getting that idea and turning it into a game is making it feasible. I have this image in my head, it's great, but how do I make that a real concrete thing? And the process Annie described is how you get there. It's making it less wild. Anyone else? Yes?
Just to kind of continue on with that, so how long would it normally take to write? How long would it be, like?
It depends on the game. So I worked on Guild Wars 2, which is an MMO. There's a massive amount of writing, no pun intended, in that game. We had 90 full-length feature films worth of voiced dialogue in that game alone. That just gives you an idea of the sheer scale of it. And we worked on that game for 5 years. And that is not an unusual amount of time for a new MMO. But smaller games won't take that long at all.
Yeah, I was going to say that it really varies by the amount of content. Like a AAA game takes a lot of time to write. But if you're writing a game like Journey doesn't have any dialogue, but it has a lot of story. And so it depends on what your parameters are. Like we talked about all the different pieces. Like if you don't have any of those, it will take a lot less time than if you have lots of them. But like AAA games have hundreds of thousands of words in them that take many teams, many people's, many times. I'm a writer. Thank you.
That was so eloquent. Thank you.
Well, two questions. What was that book you were talking about, like working with actors? And also, when writing scripts for games, I know for a movie it has to be like 120 pages, like 1 page per minute. But with a game, that can be like 2 hours, whatever hours, and extra things. How would that work for those?
Again, so the book was called, I didn't look it up before the talk, I apologize. I'm pretty sure it's called Directing Actors or Working with Actors or Talking to Actors, Judith Weston. She also has, I think, at least one, if you're in a hurry, YouTube video. It's extremely good resource for learning how to talk to actors, which if you ever do it, it's really critical. I spent many hours early in my career listening to game developers talk to actors badly and watch the joy seep out of the actors and watch them eventually give horrible performances because they had been beaten down by somebody who didn't understand how to talk to them. And then it really varies wildly, like how long. I did work on a game that had like a feature film length major story script, but it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and there are some games that don't have screenplays at all. Like you write directly into your tool, and then you have to generate scripts for the for the actors in the studios, you're not measuring the length of your game in the terms of like a minute a page anyway. So. And I know you had a question?
Yeah. What sort of opportunities to work are there when it comes to narrative design and game writing?
There are a lot of opportunities, actually. I can talk to you a little bit after the session and point you to some sites, but the best way to get into the industry and find work there is to get to know game writers, go to the sites of these major studios, like Ubisoft has, for example, an internship program. There's a particularly good one in Montreal if you are female identifying. It's called Pixels, and it's a feeder program directly into Ubisoft, so you can go into that program and then eventually end up with a job at Ubisoft. I know they've hired a lot. You can get junior narrative design positions. There's a lot of work for narrative designers. Having that extra skill set of being able to implement and do a little bit of coding gives you an extra advantage over someone who might just be a pure writer. But there's work for both. I don't think Annie or I have ever really suffered from a lack of contracts. So,
Way back?
Has your real life experience ever affected your characters? Like, I know certainly with yeah, like anything that you've done in your life, like ever really impacted
Yes. I think it might sound a little bit bland, but I think it is true that your personal experience will flow into the characters I create. Like you will create characters who have had feelings that you have had, and you will create characters that resemble, you know, your crazy uncle. I think that's we use our lives as one way of getting experience that we put into games. So I think it's I don't really write anything that's ever autobiographical directly, even in my fiction or my screenplays or my games. But I do have people that sort of stand in for situations or things that have happened to me.
I have an older brother, and like a good younger sister, I torment him as much as I can. So I find the most humiliating NPC role possible in every game I've ever written, and I name them after my brother. And then I send him videos of the humiliating things happening to the NPC, so he won't miss it. He was horribly beat up in Dishonored, Death of the Outsider, just so you know. My brother. But I will say that you're a writer, and when you're writing for games, you are putting yourself into that game. It is your own experience that lies behind these words. And when they say write what you know, that means write from your experience. You know, write the things that have happened to you. You can't write a convincing character if you have no idea what that character is like or what they've been through. They're not going to be good. They're going to be flat. And you can tell when someone has written something that they don't understand because it doesn't work. It's usually a stereotype, and it's poor, and it's flat. And Annie is trying to steal the mic from me and feel it.
I just want to say about write what you know, which is the most misinterpreted piece of writing advice ever, because it is true, but it does not mean that you cannot write about people who are not from your own experience. It does not mean that you need to be an alien to write an alien story. What it means is that you need to look at the emotional wealth of your life and use that to put into your hobbits and elves and aliens and people from other countries that you're going to write. So it literally does not mean that you must write about, you know, being a game dev.
True, and you can hire people who are consultants who can fill you in on what it's like to be one of these groups. I mean, there are diversity consultants, there are disability consultants. Billy Lurkin, Death of the Outsider, only has one eye, and we spoke to a disability consultant to make sure that we understood what that experience was like for her. She has a prosthetic arm given to her by the outsider. What would that feel like for her? And we learned a lot just by consulting with someone who knew what it felt like to have a disability, and I think it made Billy's character richer in the game a lot better because we did it. Sorry. No, I'm done.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, just a cautionary note that you definitely should not necessarily, I think having consultants is a great idea, and you shouldn't just, I didn't mean to say that you could just write anybody that you want to. You need to educate yourself and use consultants or people who've had those experiences if you are writing from people who have a radically different experience from your own. You need to do your research.
Anyone else?
What's it like working for a Swedish-based studio?
It's great.
Paradise.
It's great. 5 weeks of paid vacation, universal health care. I ride my bike to work every day. I sold my car. So I like it a lot personally. Your experience may vary.
It's pretty awesome. I'm not going to contradict her. I lived in Finland before Sweden, and both of them socialist hellholes, you know, all this mandatory vacation and time off. I just started at Massive in December, and I'm like, I'm going to take off 2 weeks and go to this conference in May. And they're like, yay, go, have fun, that's great. I mean, you come in, you do your work, you work hard while you're there, but everyone expects you to have a work-life balance, and they take that very seriously there. So don't be afraid to move to another country and try it out and see what it's like. There's some really cool opportunities overseas. And I'm sorry, but there's a little bit of a trash fire happening here in the US these days. So, I don't know, give it a shot. Yep.
And how did you end up with meeting up in a Swedish studio?
How do we get there?
Yeah, how did you end up in that position?
I was unhappy at my job, and I knew I needed to move out of my apartment in Vancouver, Canada. And so I started looking online for jobs, and I had no intention of moving. And then I found this job, and I applied on a whim. And then I flew out for the interview, and I was like, I could really live here. This is really nice. I really like these people. This seems like a really cool project. So I did it, and took a leap of faith. I had no intention of moving, and I'm really glad I did. Anybody else? Question?
From your personal experiences working with a lot of AAA games, what would you say is a game that you helped produce that you're the most proud about? That when you mention you're in that kind of field, what's the game you would first mention is you being a part of?
That's really a hard question. I mean, again, every project I've worked on, I found something to love about it. I mean, maybe it was a shooter and it wasn't entirely the kind of game that I would play, but you get very invested in what you're working on, particularly when you're working on it for several years, and it's really important, and you always find something about it that you love. I'm very proud of Death of the Outsider. It was one of the best experiences I've had ever making a game. The team was amazing. The game was amazing. It was really cool to make. My brother got beat up. I mean, it's a game I'm extremely proud of. The game that I just finished working on at Remedy Entertainment, Control, I moved from Washington, D.C. to Helsinki to work on this game because I fell so deeply in love with the concept of it, and I really invested a lot of myself into it. So yeah, I could keep going down the list. Every game I've made has something that I love about it.
Me too. One of the, actually, when you're a developer, you're a little too close, so you also see what didn't happen in the game, that you see the things that you wanted to happen that didn't happen because of the realities of game development. But I'm proud of some parts of everything I've worked on, for sure. And one of the things I'm really proud of is one of the, which is probably the single worst reviewed thing I've ever been involved with, but Dead Rising 3 had 4 small DLCs, and one of them had their first female person of color lead in that, and I was really proud of making that happen because I got really annoying to them. I insisted on it happening, and I was proud of that.
I think we have time for one more question. So, anyone? Okay. Well, all right.
Thank you so much, everybody.